Thank you so much, Darla. We're really grateful to have the opportunity to have a session like this in a grand ballroom, which says something about its importance. And I'm very happy to be co-moderating this panel with Tasha Mendoza, who is my co-chair of the LGBT caucus. We just have an hour for this session. And so I'm very mindful of the time, and I want to introduce our panelists to you, and I'm going to be brief, though. And then we're going to ask each of the panelists a question, and after they answer each one, if you would like to get up and ask a question of them, please feel free. That's what we envision. If you don't have a question, we have follow-up questions, but I think you probably will have some questions of our really interesting panelists. So let me introduce them to you. Starting from my right, after Tasha, we have Chuck Smith, and since 2016, Chuck has been the CEO of Equality Texas, and this is the leading statewide advocacy organization for sexual and gender minority rights in Texas, headquartered in Austin. He's been a leader in Equality Texas, which actually dates back, its origins back to the early 80s, although it's under a different name. And he has been very active in the leadership of Equality Texas for, I think, something like 14 years. And so we are very happy that he could be with us today. Next to him is CC Cox. And since 2010, she has been the CEO of Resource Center Dallas, which is the leading, I hope I can say that, the leading LGBTQ and HIV/AIDS service organization in North Texas. And she has a long history of activism and service in the Dallas LGBT community in various roles, including attorney, development, and marketing director of the Turtle Creek Corral and member of the Dallas Women's Foundation. It really has served in just many leadership roles. Last but definitely not least, but at the end of the table is Michelle Roundtree, who is Associate Professor at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work at UT Austin. And she teaches social policy, social justice and diversity, and research methods. Her research and scholarship focuses on health disparities and health equity and social determinants of health, with a particular focus on women of color. So I hope that you'll join me in welcoming our panelists. And I'm going to start us off with the first question, and the first question is for CC Cox. And that question is, it's a little long.
They'll give me time to think.
Actually, it's a two-part question. Over the long time that you've been an advocate for LGBTQ issues in Dallas, Dallas has actually become more progressive on these issues. At the same time, Texas has become much more conservative. And what strategies have you found most effective in making the gains that you have made in this kind of an environment? And secondly, do you think these strategies are different from what might be effective in cities that are located in more progressive states like California or New York?
Good. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I hope you're having a good conference. I'm glad you're in Dallas. I would say that the strategic approach that I've found successful and been a part of over the years is one in which to do advocacy, the foundational work is education. And I currently have the luxury, because I'm a gay for pay, and I'm paid full-time to work at a nonprofit and think about issues facing the LGBTQ and HIV communities, that's a luxury to be able to think about these things all day long, but that's not most people's positions, and it's certainly not the situation that most people are in when we're working with communities and maybe it's hostile or maybe just not very familiar. So that's why I feel education is so important at the beginning. And how that really has broken down for me is to assume that people don't know a lot of things. And I don't mean that in a way that, that I'm assuming people aren't smart or that they don't care or that they're not informed, but if they haven't had the need or the occasion to think about LGBTQ issues, then there's just things they're not going to know. So don't take that personally, just realize that that is why things require education. And if you can personalize and put a face to people in our community, that has been extremely powerful. And I would say that's universal regardless of what state you're operating in. So foundational level of education, even not falling into the trap of speaking jargon. Some people still don't know what LGBTQ is. I mean, that's become pretty common, but there are ways in which we talk that we don't want to exclude people. So I think to be inclusive in our language and to help people understand why that's important to us. And then build the advocacy on top of that. And there are things that are very contentious, and there's just going to be situations where people don't agree, and sometimes you know that ahead of time, and sometimes you don't. But just to stick with it. And relationships are important when you have them, use them, maintain them. And I would say what's different in Texas from some other parts of the country are that faith very often needs to be a part of the conversation here. Many of us grow up in communities of faith and we maintain that part of our life. And it seems to be more, it shows up more in the culture here. So for instance, when my friends visit from some of the coast, and we're in a public situation, I mean, it's still very common in Texas where you hear people in public gatherings start with a prayer. And that just doesn't happen in some other places. And depending on what the prayer is, some are more inclusive than others, I'll put it that way. But you do need to, it's important not to discount faith when you're doing advocacy work in this part of the country. And whether you necessarily agree with the person you're talking to who's sitting on the other side of the table or not, just understand that that's a place where you have to navigate through sometimes. And I don't know, I'll probably leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next question is for Dr. Roundtree. Thank you, Dr. Roundtree. Our question for you is, based on your research related to health disparities in the African American community, for example, HIV and other STIs, what impact do you envision changes in the current healthcare policy having on the health and well-being of the Black community in Texas?
Okay. All right. Well, I also want to echo what Cece said in terms of thanking CSWE for having this particular forum. I know that as educators, we know that our students, they're hungry for this. They really want to know how what they're learning in the classroom will prepare them for the expectations of social workers in the future. So these are real, important, significant social justice issues that I think we need to ensure that they're informed about and know how to advocate for. I would say that I am an ally for pay, both in terms of my scholarship and also in the way, in terms of my pedagogy. I think that it's important, as you think about HIV, to know the context of who is severely carrying the burden of the disease. Black men account for 33% of HIV diagnoses. Black women account for 61% of diagnoses among women. Latina women about 21%. Being here in the South, the accounts for the majority of blacks that are newly diagnosed with HIV, 63%, and African Americans, I use those interchangeably, have been living with HIV diagnosis is about 57%. So a very high percentage of African Americans within the South. We've turned on the television and we're not quite sure what twilight zone we're in. We're never quite sure what's going to shift or change when it comes to healthcare policy. There's been blatant tactics to undermine and to cripple the Affordable Care Act, which will have significant impact, cutting in half the annual open enrollment period, reducing dramatically the funding to promote the open enrollment period, closing down healthcare.com website for 12 hours on Sundays during that open enrollment period, which for those who work 9 to 5 at your most opportunity that you have to access and be able to do that is over the weekends. The requirements for companies to offer women contraceptive services and protections against discrimination for the LGBTQ plus community would be removed. Another tactic would be, and unfortunately, the significant impact of setting the groundwork to flood the market for junk insurance, which means that only those folks that are young and healthy will be given insurance, and those who come in with pre-existing conditions will pay very low premiums, but yet very high premiums over time, and end up bankrupting and, et cetera, et cetera. We know how that ends. And also the payments for insurance subsidies to be stopped that make the premiums as part of the Affordable Care Act affordable for poor people. African Americans, the impact, ACA literature has shown that the uninsured rate dropped by more than 1/3 under the Affordable Care Act. And these changes have a broad impact on whether or not people have access to getting tested. We know that being tested also informs whether or not someone's positive, and if they are, then prevention becomes treatment. And because the high rate of HIV within the African American community, it's very important to have viral suppression, which means that people are being treated. So significant, significant impact.
Thank you. And so now I have a question for Chuck. And it's a little bit similar to the question I asked CC, and that is to outsiders, non-Texans, Texas appears to be an extremely hostile environment for LGBTQ issues. And I was wondering, from your perspective, is that an accurate view? And the follow-up is, given the political environment, however you might experience it in Texas, what have you found to be the most effective ways to advocate for LGBTQ issues?
Well, I too, I want to thank you for holding your conference and being here in Dallas. The good news is that in the selection of Dallas, you picked one of 3 cities in the state of Texas that scored a perfect 100 on the Human Rights Campaign's Municipal Equality Index, and they do so because these 3 cities have fully inclusive and expansive non-discrimination ordinances that protect LGBTQ people in employment, housing, and public spaces. The reality is that there are no statewide laws in Texas that protect LGBTQ people. In fact, the only state law in the state of Texas that has any direct protection or coverage is the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act, which does not include transgender people, but does include, and again, it includes the words, quote, sexual preference as opposed to sexual orientation. That was a law that was passed in 2001. Unfortunately, it took over a decade of advocacy, more than 30 gay men who were murdered, and James Byrd Jr. being dragged to his death behind a truck before that legislation was passed. The reality is that from a policy standpoint, Texas is a hostile state. Our organization was founded in response to the Texas legislature advancing legislation, this was in the late 70s, that would have quarantined anyone who had HIV. At that time, there was no there were advocacy organizations that existed in local communities, but there was no statewide presence at our capital in Austin, and that's what gave rise to what was then called the Lesbian and Gay Rights Lobby of Texas. And again, so like 30 years later to this date, there is only one statewide law that offers any protection, that being the hate crimes law. I think the counter to that is that politics at a statewide level is different than politics at a municipal level. And fortunately, most of the laws that affect people in their daily lives tend to be ones that are localized in nature. All of the major metropolitan areas in this state, from a political standpoint, lean to the progressive end, probably with the exception of Fort Worth. But Fort Worth is one of the 3 cities that has full non-discrimination protections. Again, and I think it's important probably to point out the difference between politically this is a hostile state, but personally and at a people level, it's not. And so if it were, there wouldn't be the thriving LGBT communities that exist in this state, because it's not a horrible place to live, but politically it is a very challenging state. I would echo what Cece said in terms of the very first step of any strategy in this state is public education. And Equality Texas has 2 different legal entities, a foundation that concentrates on public education, and then an advocacy organization that focuses a lot on the state legislature. Both of those are necessary. There's a huge amount of public education that's needed and necessary in this state, and that is the foundation to any advocacy work that would be done. And we can talk later about, if you want to talk about the bathroom bill and other legislation specifically in terms of the strategies that go into defeating that. But the basis in all of that is certainly the public education.
Thank you. And as I said before, if any of you have a question that you would like to ask as a follow-up to any of the panelists, there are some microphones here, so please feel free to come up. And we'd like to give you the first opportunity to ask those questions.
So you talked about how most of the impactful laws are local ones. Coming from Indiana, we've recently had a state law that usurped the local laws. So how would you address that?
I was going to say the other thing is to recognize that horrible laws are written at a national level and then funneled to advocacy organizations at a state level. And so to the point where negative legislation that would come up in Indiana could be word for word the same legislation that would be offered in Texas. And it is. And there have been preemption legislation filed in states across the country that seek to take away the municipal powers of localities to regulate themselves. And that is part of a national movement, because the reality is across the country, a majority of almost a supermajority of states right now are conservatively controlled at all areas of government, both at the gubernatorial level and both houses of the legislature. And that leaves that in many states, the only areas where progressive policies or specifically where protections exist for the LGBTQ community is at a municipal level. And so what you're seeing in states across the country is a nationwide effort to take away the powers of municipalities. That is something that we saw in the Texas legislature in the most recent session. I think in terms of how to fight that, it was successful, or mostly successful here. Is that it was an all-out assault on local control on any number of issues in terms of setting property taxes, tree cutting ordinances, plastic bag ordinances, pretty much anything that cities home rule charter cities, at least is what they're called in Texas, have the power to regulate themselves, and there's an effort to take that away. I think, and in this state, our public education system is financed largely by property taxes, which again the rates are regulated locally with exceptions, and so trying to take taking power away from cities not only affects the specific issues at hand, but in its state it impacts the whole public education system. So what we saw were a large coalition of entities that had the shared same value of not wanting the power of cities to be gutted to fight those types of legislation.
That sounds to me like the idea of really having to reach outside of your own specific concerns to other groups of people who are also concerned about other issues, and having to make bridges with them in order to accomplish very much. And it's something that I heard a great deal when I used to live here in Texas, and more than I tend to hear in New York. And it did make me think of something that you said earlier, Cece, about faith in the conversation in this part of the country. And what it made me think about was that you were talking about knowing who the people are that you are dealing with, people on the other side of the table, and what's important to them, and how do you engage them. And because in other parts of the country, the issue might not be faith, it might be something else. But does that sound right? It's having to somehow like reach across the table, and how can you find common ground with people who you fundamentally disagree with?
Well, I think one of the strategies in the work that we do also is to remember that the LGBTQ community is so diverse, but we haven't always included voices that are part of that conversation. And keeping in mind that, I'll just set up a scenario. Let's say that you have the opportunity to advocate on an issue with someone. It's important to know who your audience is in all instances, but if you have the opportunity to comprise your own audience, then comprise it wisely and have someone who can, many times we're involved in issues where it's a public forum, maybe we're speaking at an elected board, the Transportation Board or Dallas City Council or something like that, where it's an elected body and the forum where you advocate is public. So we will think about whose voices should be heard, or how could various components of our community be represented. So a person of faith, people of color, various ages, various sectors of the city, if we're talking about a city issue, those types of things. So be mindful about who you're talking to and how you're representing. And I don't mean to make it sound like everything is contrived, but it's just a mindfulness about diversity is really what I'm suggesting.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Irene Burnton. I'm with the Arizona State University, and thank you very much for your panel. I guess I wanted to ask a question to each of the panelists, and kind of the reason why I'm here. If you could, wave a magic wand and had schools of social work basically be supportive to what it is we're talking about at this panel, what would you have them do, and how could they be more effective in terms of supporting the work that each of you do?
Well, I think as an instructor, we first have to help our students to realize that how we respond to the social welfare needs of communities is ideologically based. So that they have to be able to know what values drive certain responses. And if they feel like as part of their career they're not going to at all be political, then that's problematic. You know, a lot of students will say, oh, well, I just want to help people, but I don't want to get involved in the mess of politics. Well, we have to help students to demystify the fact that the majority of social work positions are funded through the legislative process. So that if you are not actively involved to ensure that it's responsive from a lens of social work values, then you're also out of a job. And I think what's also, which my personal opinion would be, we need to be working towards putting ourselves out of a job, but that's an aside. The students need to benefit from learning the legislative process. Here in Texas, the legislators meet every 2 years, and being frank with them that a bill at every juncture really is set up to fail. And so to know at what juncture within that process where public input can be the most influential, and how. So walking them through that process all of a sudden seems that it's within reach, and that they may very well have an opportunity to impact it in a way that's positive for the communities that we serve. The Steve Hicks School of Social Work at UT is 2 or 3 blocks from the Capitol. So I taught 2 sections of social policy, so we walked over and we listened to the public testimony during the sanctuary bill conversations and also the bathroom bill. And I think what was illuminating for students was to see how they could have, for both of those issues, the majority of the people come up, share their narrative, and to say, absolutely not, the state of Texas is better than this, and then have very few people in support of it, and then the legislators vote for it to go through. So for students to be enraged that where is the civic recognition for how the people have spoken as to what they want. So what was actually nice about that process is many of our students were giving thought to political careers. And I actually support them in doing that so that there'll be more social work values within the public forum. So first of all, we have to demystify the process as educators, as social workers. We need to teach our students many ways in which they can advocate. Letters to the editor. My students write letters to the editors, many of which got published. Op-eds, many of which got published. So that also affirms to them their sense of agency, that they're giving voice. They're finding different, multiple forms by which to increase people's awareness for these issues and to also connect that to real human beings in which it impacts.
Thank you. Thank you. My organization has benefited directly from social work interns from the UT School of Social Work. And Dr. Padilla has been a faculty sponsor for interns. And it is exactly true that there is a place for both clinical social workers and non-clinical social workers in the work that we do. You're correct in terms of at the hearings, the public testimony against the bathroom bill and the public testimony against the Show Your Papers bill was 14-1 against the bills, and yet they still pass, and that speaks to the political hostility. But I think the powerful part of that is that we need social workers and to testify about the harm that bad legislation causes to people. We need people to talk about negative outcomes to students. We need people to talk about negative outcomes to youth. We need to put forward and say over and over again and show over and over again how this legislation harms real people. And we need to guilt and shame lawmakers every step of the way when they're passing bills for purely political purposes that they know are bad and that they know are not solving problems and that they know hurt people. And then to your point, we need social workers to consider being legislative aides and work in state representatives' offices and work in state senators' offices, learn how the process works, learn how to develop testimony to support good legislation, to oppose bad legislation, and then we need good people to run for office. We need lots of good people to run for office. The only way to change bad laws is to get rid of bad lawmakers and people, social workers that bring those values. That's who we need to represent the general public in political bodies.
I'll just toss in a comment. I'm a big fan of the face-to-face or engagement. So if you have opportunities for the students to either have folks from different communities come in and speak to a class, or for members of a class to go out into a community and either do some volunteering or public service or learn about an organization, I think that can be a really powerful exchange. And we've probably all spoken on lots of panels at universities. I know I have. And there are about 200 LGBTQ community centers across the United States, and they range in size from being run strictly by volunteers to up to $100 million budgets. So they're not all the same, but they are the touchstone of most LGBTQ local communities. And so if you live in a place where there's a center, that's a good place to find folks who would be willing to, often willing and very happy to engage with you.
Thank you. Excuse me, if someone else from the audience has a question, please feel free to come up to the microphone at any time.
I have a follow-up question for Dr. Roundtree, if nobody's at the mics. So you definitely gave us a picture of the impact. And so now I'm kind of curious to know, both locally and nationally, with respect to your work regarding HIV/AIDS in communities of color, what kinds of promising developments do you see in terms of trends, whether it be in research or practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what quickly comes to mind is the access to PrEP, to Truvada, which is a daily pill that you can take that diminishes your risk for HIV by about 90 or 92%. I think that it's been very well marketed to the gay male community, and that there needs to be more efforts to reach other underserved communities like women of color. But I would say it's been a long time coming that we're able to say that people can have some self-efficacy by taking a daily pill where they can ensure that they are not infected with the disease. So I would say that, and I'm not suggesting that we have not had some real trends that we can end up celebrating. The decline among all populations for HIV has been by like 25%. And it's also stabilized among African American gay and bisexual men. Locally, there are now 2 clinics that offer PrEP, when I say locally, in Austin, at no cost to folks. I'm one of 4 founders of a nonprofit called the Center for Health Empowerment, and we exist specifically in order to provide sexual health services for communities of color in a way that since January we've provided about 200 services to 200 folk. And we've been able to reach most of our clientele at this point are Latino MSM, and we're using more expanded outreach to also reach African American MSM Black women, and also Latino women.
Thank you.
Well, I have another one.
Oh, wait, we have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Even better.
Hi, I'm Mary Mulvaney from School of Social Work, the Steve Hicks School of Social Work at UT Austin. And I just wanted to see if y'all would talk a little bit about the law that was passed that actually does allow people to discriminate, especially in child welfare, for anybody who's wanting to foster or adopt. If it goes against your religious beliefs, you can now say, we're not going to take that family or that couple or that individual. And I'm, you know, we know that people from California could not come to this because of that law. And I know that there are some individuals who decided to stay away. And I just wonder if y'all have any ideas about what we need to do to change that. Anyway, what do y'all think?
I'm glad that we're taking time to talk about it because it's not at this point in time it might just be Texas specific, but it's not going to stay that way. The legislation that's referred to was House Bill 3859 in Texas, which passed in our most recent legislative session. It allows a child welfare provider to decline to provide services based on religious beliefs. It's written in such a way that a provider is not limited to a child welfare organization. A provider is defined in a way that extends all the way down to a foster parent. So it's anyone throughout the chain of delivery of services. It's a horrible, horrible bill. Most of the attention that it got focused on the ability to deny parents, likely same-sex parents, the ability to foster or adopt. What our greater fear and what got less attention, but we tried to amplify, is our fear is to the harm of youth in care. And this law will allow for refusal of contraception services. It will allow for potentially putting children into conversion therapy. It will allow for children to be forced to participate or attend religious services that don't conform either to their own beliefs or force them to participate in things against their will. It is written in such a way that unfortunately the only advocate for youth in care is the youth. There is no mandatory reporting to the state by any provider of what they will refuse to do. And so the only way that anyone's going to find out about that, if we're talking, well, in both instances, is the only way that we're going to find out if services have been denied is if prospective parents report them or if youth in care report them. This is a huge place where I think that social workers can play a role in this process, is that ultimately we have to get rid of this bill. The legislation will be litigated. It's unconstitutional. But we're not moving forward here swiftly because a similar bill in Mississippi was challenged and the Fifth Circuit denied standing to the plaintiffs. And so it's really important that to file litigation to challenge this bill in Texas, that we need to have plaintiffs who have been directly harmed by the bill. And that means we either need, we're going to need youth that are in state care or prospective parents who have been denied to participate as foster or adoptive parents. Equality Texas, the ACLU of Texas, and Lambda Legal are all working collaboratively, and we're trying to connect with and network with supportive child welfare delivery organizations to try and create some sort of a warning system or a notification system so that we can identify who's being harmed. And that, that perhaps is the only way that we're going to find who the youth are that are being harmed by the legislation. The reason that I say it's important to consider this beyond Texas is because Religious refusal in child welfare services is the default piece of legislation in states that are unsuccessful in passing transgender bathroom bills. And again, recognizing that this whole field of of horrible legislation is being produced by national organizations, right-wing think tanks, that there is a nationwide agenda, again, of writing cookie-cutter bad legislation and trying to pass it in states. And in states where bathroom bills die, the next fallback is child welfare religious refusal, and that's what happened in this state. So it's going to happen. It is happening in other states. Again, it will be important to try and challenge these bills, and by litigating them and trying to demonstrate that they're unconstitutional. Again, I think social workers can play an important role if they come in contact with anybody that's being harmed by the legislation in place.
It sounds like it's an interesting thought that those of us in other parts of the country really should pay attention to what's happening in places like Texas or Mississippi, because these might be states where laws like this are introduced first, but they may be then heading our way, especially if they're successful. I actually wanted to ask for all three of you, in addition to these issues that we've talked about, what do you see heading toward us or heading towards you in the future, issues that are coming, likely to be coming from the legislature, or things that are likely to be challenging that you are thinking about and trying perhaps to head off if possible, if any?
I'm really concerned about attacks against the transgender community, because I think for legislation and policy, they're an easy target. And we were successful as a movement, whether you agreed with it or not, that it was the place to put your political capital. It ended up working. Marriage equality. And part of the reason why I think we have marriage equality is because it's pretty easy to understand in our culture marriage. It's either in your family or your next door neighbor, or it's on the TV. It's just not a complicated concept. And so therefore it's easy to contrast when you have a couple or two people who cannot get married compared to those that can. It's much more complex. Our society is not as familiar with the real challenges of transgender folks and what that means to live transgender, what transitioning is, et cetera, and I think the challenges and the discrimination that they face. So that's part of why it's also a wedge issue, an easy wedge issue. And you just look to the federal level, the administration's order that, or demand that transgender people not be able to serve in the military. It's just all around us. And when the Texas legislative session opens again in 2019, is it going to be the first thing on the radar screen again? So that's definitely, it's not just coming our way, it's here, and I think it's going to remain here for a while, a vulnerable community.
I think, well, again, it comes back to there are three principles that are sort of the foundation for all of the negative legislation that targets the LGBTQ community that will happen on a nationwide basis. And those three tenets are: one, that marriage should be limited to only between a man and a woman; two, that sex should only happen in the context of that marriage; and three, that sex is immutable from birth. Those three beliefs are the foundation for all of this horrible legislation, and those three beliefs our opponents are not going away. We should expect to see legislation that will try and define in statute that sex is immutable from birth and that cannot be changed. There is a movement to try and take away the existence of gender diverse people. There certainly is an ongoing anti-marriage movement, and if you think, oh, how could that be? It's not necessarily focused on overturning the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell, but it is tied again to this religious refusal movement of we're going to look for opportunities to use religious refusals or license to discriminate or deeply held religious beliefs to deny services in every aspect of people's lives. And so there's legislation that came up here that fortunately didn't advance, but it's coming up in states across the country in terms of refusing to serve, that even extends to allowing, I mean, we have legislation here that would have allowed psychiatrists, psychologists, and counselors to refuse to treat people based on religious beliefs. We've had legislation offered that would allow medical professionals and emergency medical professionals to deny service based on religious beliefs. The whole concept of religious refusals is going to happen in bits and pieces, and I say that because Texas is one of many states across the country that has broad religious freedom protection acts, and states have in most states that have attempted to first get rid of those laws completely and have been unsuccessful. And so plan B is, if we can't rescind the whole law, let's take it in little bits and pieces and maybe we can get by with that. And that's part of why the child welfare refusal bill passed, because it was a narrow slice or one piece of this universe of denying services that there wasn't a huge audience to push back against it. And that's not to knock your profession, but because they were there and they were advocating, they just simply weren't listened to. Again, religious refusals are going to be used across the board as a way to try and find ways to discriminate.
Well, I would just say that obviously I agree, and our responsibility as educators, again, around this demystifying process is most students believe that the majority of the work happens during the legislative session, but no, the work happens now. Most students don't know who their elected officials are. Here in Texas, there is an online website where you can key in your information, and then who represents you either in the House or the Senate pops up. So arming yourself with information on knowing who to call, who to flood with emails, who to make appointments with, right? For students to be empowered to know that they can actually go and visit the offices of their legislatures. They won't necessarily get an opportunity to speak to their legislators per se, but in recognizing that they will meet with the staffers. They are taught how to organize information and present information in such a way that the staffers can then therefore take back to the legislators. All provide our students with the tools that they need to recognize that, yes, they can do something. It was a very powerful opportunity of democracy to be able for our students to go over and actually vote, and to know that they can get that far. But the work is now. Our work is always. But they have to be provided those tools.
We just have a couple of minutes left, so you'll have the honor of the last question.
Thank you. I'm from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And on my side of the pond, we have a flip legislation where families are denied the opportunity to adopt and foster because they may hold religious beliefs. And I wonder where we might find that balance. And so on both ends, we have issues. Somebody's rights are being violated at both ends. And so I wonder, where do we imagine striking a balance?
Well, that's a great question. And it comes up in the classroom always. And usually what I say to my students is, it's not about you. It's about the people that we serve. So first and foremost, it's about their self-determination. And we embrace people and all of who they are in their texture. And our personal opinions, our faith, are, quite frankly, secondary to that. We're informed by expanding, celebrating the growth of that individual that we're quite humbled to be able to serve. You know, for a lot of religious affiliation, a core of that value is also very similar to social work, which is service. And from a religious perspective, I think that that could be, could inform service towards folks in ways that do no harm. Did I answer your question? I have a lot more. Coffee, maybe? Okay, all right. I'll even buy.
I am sorry that we don't have more time. These are such important issues, and we could probably talk about them for quite a long time more. But we don't have more time, and so I want to thank CSWE again for the opportunity to have this session at the 8 p.m. I want to thank CSWE because CSWE and those of us from the caucus worked very closely together to put this session together. I want to thank my co-moderator, and especially I want to thank our panelists. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming.